Oh,
Oh,
no, I'm going to leave. Oh, no, this
continue.
is
All right, looks like everything's good there. So we'll start. I just want to say, yeah, welcome to, this is our first meeting of the Connecting Science Society student organization of fall 2020. So before we get into kind of our topic today, which is 5G, and all the controversies and conspiracies around that, I did want to just have a couple notes we have here. The first being that we envision this semester, possibly next semester, that we're still going to stay active, but we're going to kind of tune it down to just one meeting per month. We'll all be virtual, and they're kind of like this journal club discussion, presentation style meetings. And depending on who's giving the presentation and what the topic is, it may be more skewed towards the discussion side or more skewed towards the presentation side. But I envision most of the meetings to be similar to this. Second point is that while our Constitution does state that we will collect dues, we've decided that this semester we're not going to collect dues, just it's all virtual. We're not holding any pizza parties or anything like that. So yeah, don't worry about that. We are going to have we're going to at least just monitor who comes to all the meetings, just as far as next year when we get to electing the executive committee, just to have an idea who's been coming to the meetings. And then another point, as far as communication goes, we are in the process of trying to set up a listserv instead of just a list of emails we have. I think everyone, I don't know, so Christian, are you on our email list? Did you get the email from Connecting Science to Society email?
Yeah, I think so. The subject line was just connecting science to society. Is that correct?
I believe that should have been the sender, yeah.
Yeah.
Because we sent it out there, and we also sent it out through multiple like office or grad student listservs.
Yeah, it looks like I've been getting the emails all the way back to when elections were going on.
Oh,
So
perfect. All right.
yeah,
Sounds good. So we don't have to worry about getting your email.
yeah,
So
and
that's good.
I just saw the Slack link, and I'm looking into that right now.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah. So that's still at the moment, we're mainly using it like for kind of executive committee stuff because there's not a whole lot of people on that, but I think that'll be a good one to get going, especially because the organization that we're like the national organization we're not yet linked with, but planning to be linked with does do all their stuff over Slack.
Okay.
So that's kind of communication wise, we do plan to set up a listserv instead of just sending out to a list of emails. And then depending on how many people were here, I was thinking about doing introductions. I guess we could go just briefly through again and kind of give our introductions. I'll start with myself. So I'm Riley. I'm the current president of the organization, and I'm a third-year grad student in the physics department, specifically studying the northern lights or the aurora. Um, and so I guess next, if Kira, you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Kiera. I'm a third year in the molecular medicine program, and I study cancer metastasis in peripheral nerve sheath tumors, and I'm the secretary.
All right, and the next on my list would be Christian.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm in the civil and environmental engineering department, fourth year PhD candidate. Um, I heard of communicating science to society. I think it was last semester, pre-COVID, before it was at like the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences, Technology, and Policy Fellowship workshop. So sounded like a great thing that you guys have got going here, and yeah, I signed up for the email list and I've been kind of following along, and hopefully we'll be able to get more involved as we go forward. But yeah, I study biodegradation of PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls. So that's what my research is about. But yeah, excited to be part of the group and part of the discussion.
Awesome. Next is Cody.
All right. Yeah, my name is Cody Poe. I'm a second year in the molecular medicine program. I work in the lab with Dr. Mary Wilson, where I study metabolism and parasitology. We focus on the Leishmania species. And yeah, one of the original founding members of STS and currently the VP of Relations. Yeah.
All right. Next, I got Emma.
Hi, I'm Emma. I am a third year epidemiology PhD student / candidate now. My research interests are in like health disparities in general. Most of what I do is cancer related. I have specific interests in women's health, mostly breast cancer and like endometrial or cervical cancer, but also things like preterm birth and any like social cause of disease is interesting to me too. Oh, and I'm VP of Media and Outreach, I think is my title.
Yeah, that's correct. All right, and then last, I think, is Karai. Though if you
Hello.
want,
That's fine. I can, assuming you guys are okay with the fridge, I can like talk. So hi, my name is Karai Mahanti. I am a fourth year PhD candidate in the Department of Epidemiology, and I study lactic-borne diseases, with specific focus on Lyme disease and understanding both the immunologic mechanisms behind it and the social economic factors associated with it.
awesome. Thanks, everyone. Quick introductions. So, without that, continue with the presentation here. So I figure this will go basically, I'll give a kind of brief presentation on 5G, sort of what it is, some of the conspiracies I've kind of researched a little bit, and then some of the actual real like scientific issues with potentially with 5G. Then after that, we can have a short kind of discussion about 5G and potentially like possible policy solutions, ways to communicate better about it, talk to people that might believe in the conspiracy theories, things like that. So we'll start here. So 5G, something you might have heard of, and if you haven't heard of 5G, you've probably heard of like 4G, 3G, 2G. These are all basically the different generations, as the G stands for, of the way our devices connect to the internet, basically using cellular data. And so 5G is basically being pushed as the next step after 4G, after the fourth generation, to basically just add things that we need as more devices come online, as we're using more data, just as a society in general. So 5G is kind of the name for it, but what specifically is it physically? Like, what's the physics behind 5G? And to do that, we kind of have to think about light. So as humans, we're kind of accustomed to thinking of light as just colors. You have your spectrum from red to violet, because that's what our eyes were evolved to be able to detect. But light itself is actually just a basically electric and magnetic fields oscillating. And so while our eyes can detect that specific range that we see as color, there are basically wavelengths of this light that have longer wavelengths, basically on the side of the red light that we see, but farther, longer wavelengths that we can't see, as well as wavelengths that have shorter wavelengths than we can see. So basically on the other side of the blue spectrum of what we can see. And so it's a specific part of this spectrum that our devices are actually using to communicate. So they're basically acting just as you might think of it like a flashlight that we just can't see, a flashlight and a light receiver, maybe like a telescope, to be able to communicate between cell towers, and cell towers communicate back to the devices themselves. So it's all this communication is taking place basically just with light. And so kind of a visualization of this is sort of what we call the electromagnetic spectrum, or basically the light spectrum. And so in the middle here, you see the visible light. We have our red to violet spectrum. But you can see this is just kind of smack in the middle of a whole wide spectrum of light, where the visible light, the color, is not the whole picture. And so you have stuff with longer wavelengths, you have stuff with shorter wavelengths. And our devices, our phones, and anything really that has a cellular SIM card in it communicates via a part of this spectrum. So kind of as an example, so I guess, yeah, let's see here, next slide. Yeah, so sort of as a reference, so like what part on the spectrum do you want to communicate on? So when you're trying to decide a wavelength to communicate with, there's kind of two things you have to take into consideration. The first being, how far can that signal travel? So obviously, if your signal's only able to travel, a few feet, something like that, it's not gonna be very good for communication. But then you also, the other thing you have to take into consideration is how much data can you transport on that signal. So those are kind of the two things that you have to consider. And when you get to the shorter wavelength side of things, so kind of over here by these, on the other side of visible, the ultraviolet, X-ray, gamma rays, a really short wavelength light, you can store a lot of data in those wavelengths, because the shorter the wavelength, basically the more oscillations you have in some period of time. And if you think of kind of one oscillation as one byte, you're basically going to have more bytes in a period of time, so you can store more data. But unfortunately, the shorter the wavelength you get, the easier that type of light is to be absorbed by things like trees, buildings. So it can't, basically the shorter the wavelength, the more data you can store, but the shorter it will travel. So you kind of have to weigh both of those considerations when you're trying to figure out a wavelength to communicate with. So as far as our communications go, as kind of a reference here, this is sort of the range of wavelength that we use for your typical FM radio, so things that you're going to listen to on a car, something like that. So that's FM radio. The current state of things, so 4G is kind of in this spectrum here. And so 5G is actually split into 3 different bands, so the first band, this low band, in my opinion, seems to be more of just a marketing hype kind of thing, because it's basically identical to 4G. It's just a slightly upgraded 4G. As you can see here, basically it's spectral range, where the part on this spectrum that it is basically the same as 4G. But as you move into mid-band 5G and then high-band 5G, you start getting progressively to the shorter wavelengths of light. And that's because basically as more devices are coming online that can connect to cellular data and use more of it, we need to be able to store more data and transport more data. So you need to use a shorter wavelength of light. But because we're using a shorter wavelength of light, it is harder to communicate over longer distance. So you basically have to set up more cell towers to be able to do that. I think with high band 5G, you basically have to have line of sight to the cell tower to actually be able to get your device to communicate with it. So for when I looked at the main at least current use cases of this are basically just in really concentrated areas where you have a bunch of devices. So like cities, airports, places like that. So basically that's kind of a brief introduction to what the actual physics are behind cellular data and 5G. It's basically just the signals that you're sending out are basically just a different wavelength of light that we can't see with our own eyes, just a little bit longer wavelength than we can make out. But because there's a whole lot of technical jargon and a lot of technology involved with doing this, as you might imagine, there's quite a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding it. So there's a whole bunch of different types, but the one I think that's most prevalent today is that 5G caused COVID-19, the current global pandemic. So I did a little bit of research into this and tried to figure out if there was any sort of coherent story behind this conspiracy. And from what I could see, there really wasn't anything coherent, as you might imagine, with a conspiracy theory. But I was able to pick out a few kind of interesting things, different conspiracies that I thought were interesting and seemed to be showing up kind of in multiple places as maybe like the most common conspiracies. So it sort of seems the way that this is linked to the pandemic is that in 2019, Wuhan installed a whole bunch of 5G towers. And then, would you imagine that after they did all that, coronavirus started to spread from Wuhan. So clearly there is a very strong link there. Not being sarcastic at all there, but so that seems to be the link that people use to correlate the two. And then as far as the way that 5G actually causes the virus, there seems to be a whole bunch of different theories on this. One of them being that 5G somehow triggers the virus. To be honest, I have no idea what this actually means. What people are trying to get at, that maybe the virus is somehow in us all the time and just dormant, and the 5G signal somehow triggers it and causes it to become active. I really have no idea with that one. The next one is that 5G suppresses the immune system somehow and basically just makes it easier for us to catch the virus. And Cody, you have your hand raised. Do you have a point to put in? Yeah, if anyone wants to jump in at any point, please do.
Yeah, so one of the conspiracy theory behind triggering the virus is that there's a belief that in our own genome we have all the genes for basically everything that's ever lived, and that the virus is part of that, and that 5G somehow manages to activate that within us as it causes cellular damage, though I don't think it has the wavelength power to actually do DNA damage. Yeah, I just wanted to that was what I've seen behind at least that portion of the conspiracy.
Okay, thanks. I was not aware of that. That's definitely an interesting theory there, and kind of along the lines, it seems like, to the next conspiracy theory, which to me seems one of the most crazy ones, and that is that 5G, so these wavelengths of light, cause our cells to release these toxins, and that the coronavirus isn't actually a virus, but is in fact these toxins being released into our body. So that's definitely a very interesting one as well. And I think when I looked into that, they were also making some point that before the 1918 flu was when a bunch of radio towers were installed or something like that. So clearly radio towers were responsible for the 1918 flu, as 5G now is responsible for COVID, but something like that. And so then the next kind of conspiracy theory, not really linking the cause there, but just that the pandemic is actually just a distraction to install a bunch more 5G towers, and we all will just be concentrating on the pandemic and won't realize as they install these. And then finally, this is something that's a sort of conspiracy theory that's been around for quite a while, just with all sorts of radio, Wi-Fi, any sort of wireless signals, and that's that they can cause brain damage, headaches, cancer, things like that. So I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but these are all very wrong. Definitely conspiracy theories there. In my opinion, some of them I think are more crazy than others. Some of them, you know, if someone doesn't know the science, might be more inclined to believe. So for some of those, like that 5G triggering the virus or the toxins being released from the cells, I'm not even really sure exactly if that's really worth going down. So for this, I decided to kind of give some of the science, maybe just debunking a little bit, just the idea that these wireless signals can cause any sort of noticeable um, difference or noticeable change to our bodies. Just as kind of a short kind of debunking thing. So sort of ask the question, can these signals actually affect us? And so the answer to that is sort of a yes and a no answer, and it kind of depends. So like I said, the shorter wavelength of light you have, the more energy you can transport in a certain period of time. And that also corresponds to the fact that the shorter wavelength of light, the more, basically it's the higher energy, so you can store more, I guess, data, and it has higher energy. So on the far right of this spectrum, you have things like X-rays, gamma rays. These are extremely high energy types of light, and they're actually what's known as ionizing, have ionizing energies. So basically they have the ability to split electrons from the rest of the atom, and these can actually cause some very serious damage. But luckily they're also really hard to create. So things like gamma rays pretty much only get created on Earth through nuclear reactions, nuclear bombs, things like that. So yes, these kind of energies on the far right of the spectrum can actually cause serious damage. But as you start moving farther left, the longer wavelengths of light, you actually, really the only way that you can cause any sort of effect is basically with heating, so thermal heating. So kind of like you feel if you step out into the sun, you can feel yourself getting warmer. That's basically the main way that these things can transfer energy to us. The only sort of interesting difference to that is actually the UV or ultraviolet spectrum, which is what gives us sunburns, actually is kind of splits the difference a little bit there. Well, it doesn't have enough energy to actually do that ionizing and cause the really bad damage. It does have enough energy to actually trigger a chemical reaction, which can damage our DNA, which is what leads to skin cancer and the sunburns and things like that. But pretty much anything more to the left of that longer wavelength, the only way it can transfer energy is basically just via heating. So no different than just standing out in the sun and feeling yourself heat up with that. And then the farther left you go, the longer wavelength, the less and less energy they basically have. And so the less and less energy they can transfer to us. The only kind of difference to this is around the microwave wavelengths. It just so happens the wavelengths in that part of the spectrum actually correspond to the same wavelength or frequency that water molecules actually vibrate at. And so what can happen at that frequency is that you can resonate with those water molecules and actually cause them to vibrate at a larger, basically vibrate more, which basically has the effect of heating that water molecule up to a level that's, I guess, more efficiently than you would with wavelengths that are around that. And it just so happens that microwave frequency is also the frequency that these 5G, 4G, the cellular signals communicate at. So there is the possibility that these signals could heat up, water in our bodies to cause some sort of effect. So then we have to ask the question, well, it is physically possible for this. The physics works out. What's the actual kind of like order of magnitude? Is it actually something that's noticeable? And so to do this, I kind of took this sort of brief example here, and suppose that we're standing directly beneath one of these 5G towers. So from a little bit of research I saw, if you have, where you're at, if you have basically a power flux, so the amount of power flowing through a certain area in this wavelength of light of about 300 watts per meter squared, that can cause about a half a degree rise in temperature. So you'll feel yourself, you get about half a degree, so what's that, about 1 degree Fahrenheit warmer. So something that's probably noticeable, but still fairly insignificant. So suppose we're standing at the bottom of one of these 5G towers. So on an average, or kind of on the upper end of an average cell tower, uses about 5 kilowatts of energy. So if we assume that this cell tower is able to transmit 100% of that energy, which is sort of that ideal case, into the cell signal, into that 5G signal, and we're standing at the base again, so I assume the tower is about 30 feet tall, so we're 10 meters below where that signal is being emitted. The total area then that signal is going to be spread out over, basically the area of that sphere, 10 meters from the actual emitter, ends up being about 1,000 square meters. So if you spread out that area over then that full area, or the energy over the full area, you end up with, basically if you're standing right at the base of the tower, the amount of energy you're going to be receiving is about 5 watts per meter squared. So you can see that's almost 100 times less than this amount, just to cause a half a degree, basically, change in temperature. So from kind of this sort of very rough calculation, you can see that basically the amount of energy that even like an ideal cell tower could transfer, basically as close as you could get to it, is insignificant. And also kind of another reference, the amount of energy, if you were to stand out just in like full sunlight, that's, I believe, just a little over 1,000 watts per meter squared, is what basically the direct sun at the Earth is. So that's kind of what you feel standing out in the sun.
Hey, really?
Yeah.
So just if we do decide to, when we do decide to post the video, for those that are just watching, sometimes like it can be easy for a lot of us to like follow along with the math as you talk through it, but some people like that visual. So I'm gonna annotate real quick. So like when you're talking about a tower, so you have a nice tower here, right?
Yes.
And if you're talking about standing at the base, see a little person. Yeah. Give a little hit. Okay. Staying there at the bottom, that's where you're talking about where you're receiving that 5 watts, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So you have that.
Yeah, thanks for that. And if you draw basically a circle centered at the top of that pole, that's kind of my base for having that 1,000 meter squared area. So you have a yes, and then you'd have a circle basically going all the way to the ground and around with a radius that's the height of that tower.
The radius,
yes, that's basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly like that.
A little more of a circle, I'm assuming, but yeah. I'm a horrible artist. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So in reality, things get a little more complicated than this. It's not exactly like that, but sort of as like this order of magnitude, you can see that the amount of energy this transfers is extremely small when compared to anything that would actually be able to possibly tell a difference, and especially when compared to something like the sun. Yeah, so that's just sort of a brief kind of, I guess, debunking bit of math there. And so I will move on then to the next slide. So that's sort of the conspiracies that don't really have any merit, but there is actually some issues with 5G and possible, actually fairly major implications that it could have to scientific work. And one of the most prevalent of those is weather forecasting. So one of the most important things in weather forecasting is being able to properly measure water vapor that's in the atmosphere. And the way that we currently do this, or one of the ways we do this, is via satellites up in space that look down on the Earth and basically measure this very specific frequency of light, this 23.8 gigahertz. And that's because that frequency happens to be a frequency that basically water molecules in the atmosphere absorb light of that frequency. So when you look at that, you can see a decrease in that frequency if you have a lot of water vapor. Now the issue with that is that the high band 5G frequency happens to overlap that specific frequency. So we'll have, if you have a whole bunch of 5G, or you expand the 5G cell towers and have a, blanketing the US, what you're gonna get is tons of noise at the frequencies that we need to measure that water vapor, and thus to make good weather forecasts. And so there's been some studies by both NASA and NOAA warning of this and saying that if things aren't done to properly regulate this, if it's just allowed to kind of run free, then it could take our weather forecasting accuracy and abilities back to like the 1980s, which would be extremely detrimental, especially with the increase of large storms and climate change. So it's definitely a real threat. It's not just the water vapor absorption frequency, it's also the ones from rain and snow that are also in danger from this 5G. So this is a known problem, and there are some things that are being done to try to address it on a policy level. So the current way it works with this whole spectrum of light, you have that spectrum with the long wavelengths, the short wavelengths. What happens at the moment is the FCC, which is the regulatory body in the US, basically will auction off portions of that frequency and sell it to companies to use for communication. And so they are aware of this issue, and what they're currently doing is basically taking that 23.8 gigahertz and considering that like a protected frequency and leaving a buffer of a certain amount of megahertz to both the left and right of that to kind of try and protect that frequency so that satellites can still measure it. But the only issue with that is that the studies that NOAA and NASA have both done, they recommend this particular noise level, negative 42, I think it's decibel watts. I'm not exactly entirely sure on the specific units of that noise, but basically the important thing is that that noise that NASA and NOAA recommend is 100 times lower than what the current FCC regulations call for. So the current regulations, at least according to NASA and NOAA, are not nearly enough to actually basically keep our forecasting at the same level and to not cause any sort of issues. Yeah, so that's basically everything I have for this presentation, just kind of going over some of the actual real issues. So I figured now we can kind of move on to a discussion phase. So I do have a couple kind of possible discussion questions, but before we move to that, I don't know if anyone has any particular questions on what I went over on the technology. I do see it looks like Aria has jumped on. It's good to see you.
Hey, good to see you, Riley. Thanks for the presentation. I came on pretty late, though.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, it's a little, are you still in California?
Yeah, I'm in California, and I gotta keep remembering it's a 2-hour difference with Iowa. So I thought it started at 9, but it started at 8.
Oh, yeah, no worries. We recorded it also, so if you missed some of it and want to see it.
Yeah, I'll have to rewatch the beginning.
Yeah, well, cool. So I don't know if anyone had any questions. Let's make sure. Generally, my explanation made sense. It does get fairly complicated when you start trying to talk about how our devices communicate. And I should note that I am not an expert on like device communications. I study the Aurora, so it's still in the physics realm. I'm definitely not an expert. So if anyone is thinking about potentially wanting to do a journal club, don't be scared if you're not like actually specifically researching that topic. If there's just a topic that interests you, yeah, feel free to propose it and come up with something.
I just wanted to say I thought well, you did a great job, but you answered so many questions that I've had like my entire life. Like the like device communication, it was just kind of like a unknown to me, and now I feel like I don't know. So maybe to answer this question, just like I don't know that people would I don't know, but maybe just like people learning about how things happen, and also knowing that like the only way that these type of um I don't know what the right word is, but the only way the type of like waves are gonna affect you is through heat energy. So like that kind of debunks those like you're gonna release the virus from within yourself type things. Like knowing that I think is a helpful context maybe.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think for me, I think one of the reasons that a lot of this gets scary is you never really is people don't realize that it's basically just light. Like light itself isn't very scary, right? The sun, we're all used to that. Even being sunburned, everyone's pretty much accepts that, especially us in Iowa that don't get a whole lot of sun exposure the winter time. Yeah, but when you hear it, like when it's referred to often, and companies and media, you hear it like 5G or EMF radiation, that kind of stuff. Those all kind of sound like scary words.
Yeah, I think the visual aids, like the low frequency bands are, you can equate those to what you listen to in your car, and that's not harmful. It's been around for years and years, and your grandpa and grandma grew up with listening to AM radio, and they turned out just fine. But then, on the opposite end of that same visual aid, you have gamma radiation, and it's like, okay, that's what, you know, melts people, so it's like that was a, very, very strong visual aid. But like, I think in just speaking very generally, the new, like, if we're going to talk about communicating to society, we focus so much on those extremes, those polar opposites, and in the middle there is where the nuance is, and where like innovation is, where 5G technology is, and so it makes sense that it can be associated with the extremes, completely harmless, or like will like meld you. So I think that's like, you have to recognize the extremes, but then provide like, I think that what you did was provide a framework, for someone who is ignorant. And I think, and just listening to their concerns too is the one of the best ways to change an ignorant mind as well. And something I heard recently was like, people change was that they will do it, but they don't like to do it when people are watching. So it's like you can provide them the information, but maybe they won't be like, oh yeah, I get it. Like now 5G doesn't cause COVID, but they'll consider.
Oh, I think we lost you there at the end there, Christian.
Oh, I was just saying that maybe they won't change their mind immediately, but then maybe the next time you see them, they'll be like, oh yes, I thought about what you said, and I looked into it more, and that's you presented a convincing argument, but maybe I just didn't admit it at the time.
Well, that's a big problem with our society right now, though. Anyways, that when they look into it, there's a lot of problems with people understanding like a real set of information versus a misleading one, or they interpret a real set in the wrong way because they don't fully understand. Like, yeah, it helps to be able to show that wavelength of light as it like in all the different spectrums. But if someone who hasn't, like, I was horrible at physics, but I kind of got what they were talking about. So when someone first proposed that this is what's going on, I was like, that doesn't make sense to me. But if someone who doesn't really understand, like yeah, there's different wavelengths. Here's the like different things. Like someone may come in and look at it like, oh, it starts here, and as it progresses, it's going to become this. So we're starting at 5G here, but over time, look, it can become this, skin melting part, because that's how the graph looks. And like, no, those are entirely separate, different wavelengths as you go across, and they're all happening just at the same time, and like that, yeah. So it's just a lot of education and trying to provide understandable material to people that have never been educated on these topics. That's the hard part.
And another thing that I'm curious about and interested in as it relates specifically to 5G and, innovations in data transfer and, just technology in general is like the geopolitical considerations too, and like national security considerations and how like national policy, like from, I don't know, the United States stance on proliferation of 5G technology and how it affects national security from, like how that, technology coming out of China, they say that it may be a national security risk to US and its allies, because it's partially state controlled. And I think that might be a reason why a lot of these conspiracies proliferate from the top down, where it's like you need to fear 5G because the Chinese might be listening, or like stealing your information. And then that translate, maybe that is not people's fear, but then it translates into through social media manipulation, one way or the other, that it ends up being 5G causes cancer, 5G causes COVID, and I just think that whole conversation is a pretty critical piece to like how these lines of thinking get started from the top.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's something I didn't include in here, and I know I've heard some about that. I don't know too much though, but I do know, yeah, that there was a whole thing. I can't remember if it was one of the Chinese companies. I don't know if it was like Huawei or maybe a different one that was building most of the 5G chips that were basically going into all the 5G towers. And I know there was a whole bunch of stuff that went around there regarding, yeah, whether those chips were safe. I know there was some stories that came out thinking they weren't, and I think some of them got debunked or were false. I know it was kind of a whole mess around that, but that is definitely a good point to bring up there.
In regards to like conspiracy theories in general, is that a lot of these will, when you break them down, a lot of them get formed because it's humanity trying to put an explanation behind something that happens just naturally. And as humans, we like to think that we are, dominant of this planet and our environment, and we've forgotten that life really wants to take us out. Like just the world in general is really out to get us. We've gotten too comfortable with this idea that we are in control. And when life actually slaps us around, we're like, oh, there must have been a reason. Look, another human must have created this. And so that's a very easy thing for people to jump on because it's us destroying ourselves, not nature doing its job.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point there as well. And I actually have a question for Aria, because I know you do a bunch of stuff with like ham radio and amateur radio stuff. Is there any sort of conspiracy theories or anything surrounding that? Because that's still sort of in that the wireless signal sort of area.
Yeah, I haven't heard any conspiracy theories per se. There are subtle things. If you're thinking of conspiracy theories, people start saying, "Oh, you could communicate with aliens using amateur radio, stuff like that." But in terms of the frequencies used in amateur radio, no, I haven't heard any crazy crackpotish ideas coming out. Although it's not so much the frequencies in amateur radio use that could cause you damage or like cell mutations or anything. It's more the actual burn from touching an antenna that's been used for a long time. So it's not that the radio frequencies can have an effect on you. It's more that the physical antennas and the amplifiers and the power sources could have an effect on you. Yeah.
Which brings us back to Riley's comment about heat being the problem at the lower end.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I wonder if some of that just has to, because you think about like conspiracy theories, and well, there might be slightly more reason why something like 5G could be, people might think it like physics wise more damage or something like that. I think maybe a lot of it just has to do with the fact that like amateur radio isn't being promoted by like large companies or like the government, things like that. Seems much less scary if it's just people that are out doing a hobby kind of thing.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is that people don't understand it well to know that it doesn't cause harm or damage. And it's kind of the fact that we use radio frequencies in everything in everyday life, from our cell phones to microwaves to the light we see. I think it's just like a lack of knowledge about that kind of stuff, and people, especially now, it's easy for conspiracy theories to spread thanks to social media. But if people just understood a little bit more, like our cell phones, they emit what, 5.4 gigahertz, something like that. Yeah, it's not that big of a deal. And then when I hear people say things about the microwave and it gives radiation to like into your food and you ingest that radiation. Well, it's true that it emits radiation because that's what radio frequency is, and it warms up the water molecules, but it's like you were mentioning, it's heat. So it's not ionizing radiation. And I've had to tell my family that and they believe me, but I tell other people that and they don't believe me. It's pretty frustrating.
Yeah, I think there's, you bring up a great point where people are just ignorant about the so much of, it's like we use our phones and our, even, oh my gosh, like now we use our laptops and everything to communicate and everything we do in the age of COVID, and people just don't understand, the basic technology of how we're viewing each other right now, and how my voice is reaching your ears, and like that is pretty crazy. And I think needs to be a greater focus in public education throughout, like when kids start learning physics and their science classes and everything like that. It's like if you can apply it to the phone, they're like the things that kids are, how their Xbox controller is communicating with their console, it's like if you can explain it in those terms and say it's not dangerous, but then if you take a look at these extremes, and you can relate it to like gamma radiation, or like you can even use pop culture references like the Chernobyl disaster. Is like huge HBO series just came out. You can say like, look at this, like this is gamma radiation and this is what causes damage, and this is like what recklessness in like applying those technologies may happen, but and like that type of thing. And I was also going to mention another reference to pop culture, like I don't know if you guys have seen Stranger Things, but like the kids and your involvement in amateur radio and ham radio, the kids in Stranger Things in their public school, were part of the radio club, and so those kids knew exactly what they were doing, and like knew radio frequency. And it's like I don't know in my old high school if there's like an amateur radio club or whatever, but if there was a proliferation of ham radio and amateur radio and understanding 5G and applying physics in that way in public school, the public might be more informed about these topics and not be so prone to proliferating conspiracy theories.
I think you make a really interesting point, like just the concept, and we're using like the term radiation on and off, and like even just that word, like we think about this in public health a lot, like we have to be super careful with the terms that we use, and we might not use the actual medical term for something because it has some sort of like public connotation. And so it's like really interesting, like people may hear radiation and the only thing they're thinking of is like gamma ray, like super like extreme end, or like things like cancer, where it's like, okay, I only know radiation in terms of that's what people who are really, really sick and are about to die get. So like, I think there's a bunch of really good points made about how like, I mean, even just like physics in general, there, I feel like there's a general notion that it's like just above people, like it's above people's heads maybe, or like it's just also it not being visible, like a lot of it, like you can't see it, it just is, you know, like these are just things that are. And so I feel like people get like it's people feel like it's inaccessible to them. And so, but like I think Riley, you did an awesome job of putting it into terms that like anyone can understand, and putting it in the context of things people are familiar with. And like the Xbox controller idea, like that, I think that's really powerful, because these ideas aren't as foreign as we think. We just like don't talk about them. And if we like started talking about them earlier, people might start associating radiation with like a full range of things that it can actually mean, rather than just like one end or the other.
Yeah, that's definitely makes sense. I think some of it also has to do with the fact that, you know, like for instance, myself in a physics field, you kind of take for granted that everyone just knows that a radio wave is another, basically just the same as light, just a different wavelength. But because that's the people that I work with every day think that, but it's not actually the case for most of the general population. They don't realize that that's not common knowledge.
No, I just learned that now, like today in the last hour. So yeah, I can only imagine how people who aren't even in like academia or science probably feel.
Well, it's awesome. I'm
No,
glad
our
I
whole
could
reason for, like,
go for it.
sorry. That was our whole point for starting this club anyway, right? Was like we've all started to realize that certain people we talk to, especially as we become more educated in our own particular fields, how little like relatives, friends, all they know, and on certain topics where you're in your own head, because you've been studying for so long, you're like, why don't you know that? Like that's a very common thing to know. And like, you know, we want to try to start this club is like, okay, so where are people misstepping like this information? How can we reword or describe it in a way that doesn't involve 15 layers of math and like a basic understanding of just how cells function?
I think it's also difficult because these topics are so nuanced that it gets hard to explain, right? Like a lot of these conspiracies have little nuggets of things that are kind of true. So like we talked about how the 5G waves themselves really don't make that much change, but like the heat conductance or something like that. So some of those concepts that take a couple of extra steps to explain, like, yeah, it could do damage, but like it'd have to be like very specific, prolonged exposure, very close, those sort of things. When people are just like, but you just said that it can do damage, so this is kind of right.
You said it heats water. I'm 70% water.
Yeah, unless they start installing 5G transmitters in your pillows and everything, then I don't think you have anything to worry about.
Hey, don't give Elon Musk another idea, okay?
You might take it and run with it.
Yeah, I definitely
Awesome.
think. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go for it, Cry.
I was just gonna say, I definitely think y'all brought up a really good point. The idea of how the bits and pieces of things in conspiracy theories that have some air of truth to them, and like trying to talk to those airs of truth and get people to understand that this is kind of a misinterpretation of the truth, can be really difficult. And I definitely have had experiences with people who have taken that tiny bit of truth in a conspiracy theory and like ran with it, and it's a painful thing to sort of deal with. But I've always learned that like the way you did it, Riley, I think that sort of is a really really have a way of doing it, like approaching it from a very almost basic sample and then moving it forward to allow people to like get to the same level as you. I think that's the best way to do it. So I really appreciate that. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I'm gonna mute so the pitch doesn't kill you all.
Thanks. I guess it's kind of a last, we can kind of wrap things up, but sort of as a last question, maybe a little bit of a, I don't have to necessarily answer it completely, but do you think there would be, is there a difference between somebody looking at the conspiracy theories? They kind of fall into two camps. One being like completely crazy, basically throwing out everything we know, the fact that like there are no viruses, it's just these toxins being released from our cells that's caused by the 5G or like triggering these virus or something, whatever that Cody was explaining, versus the kind of idea that possibly these 5G signals could be causing some sort of like brain damage via like the heating, something like that. Do you think there's a difference between a person that believes the, I guess, more of the crazy things? Is it less likely that we can convince them of the actual truth versus someone that's just kind of on that side that's had the conspiracy that has like a grain of truth to it, but it's just overblown?
I don't think there's really a difference. I think it's just one's a longer road to trek than the other. You know, you have to like, on one end, you can, if they have it based on, I guess, a negative truth, you can expand on that and like, hey, this is why, like, this is not what's going on, and like I see where you saw this, I can connect on that level, and then build their knowledge upon it. Whereas if they're just completely off the wall and you're like, okay, so here's the basics and here's what's going on, and I'm gonna try and explain through step by step why this is, you know, inaccurate. But the hardest part is really just defining out which parts all the various parts that they're inaccurate on understanding.
I kind of think, Cody, I think you said something interesting because, like, well, for me, I come at it like things I try to study are things like racism, where like the ignorance, when people's ignorance in the issue of racism and its impacts on health, a lot of times, like the ignorance is not just like, sometimes it's ignorance, people picking up a little fact and turning it into something else, and then there's like the other camp of people who are ignorant just because like they've never been exposed to it and they don't know anything about it. And so like I think about ignorance in a totally like flipped way, where I'm thinking about how like if someone feels a certain way because they just are like totally missing some points, that could potentially be easier to change than like just informing them and saying like, this is how we think about it, and this is, you know, like these are the assumptions we're making, this is how it works, this is where we go, could be easier to do than someone who is like taking a fact or like taking a small little fact and then blowing it up into something else, where like willful ignorance versus like ignorance due to just like lack of exposure. So I don't think you're wrong at all. I just think it's really interesting because you thought about it and I think you're right, like, but from like a totally opposite angle than what I tend to think about it as.
Yeah, I find that a lot of people, especially when they have that truth, those are usually the harder people to convince from just a ground point level, because they feel like they have something they you know that justifies. So it's not to educate people from the ground point level, it's to educate from the point of view of their truth. And that makes it a little bit easier typically than just starting at the ground point with someone who's completely ignorant of it, which is, yeah, just once I found like that's the way to go, that made it easier than starting from baseline.
How do you think that applies to something like 5G that's such like a foreign concept to people? Like, do you think, yeah, how do you, I don't know if you have a response to that, but I just think it's kind of, I don't know, just an interesting question.
I think that kind of comes down to like which conspiracy theory someone's going off of. You know, like Riley said, like if they're basing it on, oh, it does damage. Okay, so why do you think it does damage? And like, are they saying it does damage because of the fact it can heat water? You know, it works on that same wavelength, it can vibrate water. So, okay, so here's why that's not actually what's going to happen, and then build off of that. Or, are they just thinking that, I'm drawing a blank here, like on the other end, if they just don't understand how radio frequency works, like they don't understand, like it's a point, like it's a wavelength of light, and that, like, building off of just that basic ground level understanding of physics, that's can be a little bit different. It's really just, to me, it goes from like argument to argument on where are they basing their misunderstanding of it.
Yeah, conspiracy theorists that have like that grain of truth, it's like that is common ground that a reasonable person can, that's like common ground that both of you can stand on, and maybe they're taking it one direction and you can offer your perspective on the maybe correct direction to take it. But then a conspiracy theorist that has no basis in fact and no common ground, that's, I think, the more difficult thing, and are often not receptive to someone explaining why they're wrong, So I think the tact to take in dealing with someone like that is to not really offer an alternative, but to have them explain to you why it is that they think that, And it's like, how did you arrive at your completely outlandish perspective? It's like, where did you get this information? Why, like, how, and like, what is your opinion on like the authenticity of what you're saying, like what you're repeating in a public, oftentimes a public sphere. So it's like, I think that might be, I mean, that's all, in discussions on like the internet and with like, people that are just spouting off often like dangerous misinformation about certain things. It's like, it's like you can't convince them otherwise in a short discussion, but you can ask questions that they will often reveal their own biases and inaccuracies.
And also, while they're trying to explain it to you, they might like realize, wait, like I can't.
Yeah, like, oh, like I sound ridiculous.
I don't think they'll come to like, I sound ridiculous, to say, well, that's just, as much as we can figure out. And that's where, like, as scientists, we have to be able to like know and work them to that point of being like, all right, so here's where science says, and this is how we can take it. And then like, okay, so that point where you don't understand, this is what we actually know, and this is why, like, it actually contradicts what you've been, saying. So it's, that's where you get them down to that base level and work them back up. You have to, I think, lead them from a point of like where they are, have them explain you down to their base, and that usually, as I've come to find out, almost always like leads to either an I don't know or a scientific inaccuracy that you can correct, which then will flip and change the trajectory, and you can then guide it back up and like, look, this is where it's actually at. You were wrong over here.
Yeah, cool. Those are all definitely, really great points and great discussion. I think as far as just to make sure you don't go too long, take up your whole day, maybe cut the meeting there. But I think, thanks everyone for coming and joining the discussion. I think that was went well. As far as the journal club go, we're still, I think, figuring out exactly when and what our topic will be for next month's meeting, but definitely stay tuned for that. But otherwise, I don't know if anyone else had anything to add.
Just wanted to say thanks, and really enjoyed the first meeting, and looking forward to the next one. And I'll try to spread the word about it and get people from my department, and I've got links to Graduate Student Senate, and so I'll try to spread the word a bit about it and get people involved.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for coming also. Cool. Well, if I think that's everything,
Sounds good.
And Kira, you can, if you record it, if you have good enough internet, if you wanted to, you could like upload it to the OneDrive.
Sounds good.